The story kicked off on the heavily guarded Colombian border, where a cargo truck carrying what looked like ordinary imported goods passed through a checkpoint. Once it was in the clear and had reached its destination, however, its real cargo was revealed. It was an American man named Chris Cheney. The smugglers who brought him across tried to shake him down for more money, but Chris, who had already paid a high price for the illegal transport, wasn't having it. Despite being outnumbered by two armed men, the seemingly ordinary American had enough, and he dismantled them both with brutal, efficient violence. After dealing with the smugglers, Chris's true mission began to take shape. He was first seen visiting the grave of a woman he had clearly loved very much, his eyes filled with a cold determination. It was clear he was about to do something crazy. Sure enough, he then made his way to a lavish mansion where he began to surveil a teenage girl named Elisa. She was the daughter of a powerful cartel boss named Vicente, a man who ruled the Colombian black market with an iron fist. But despite his fearsome reputation, Vicente was a kind and obsessively protective father to Elisa, a devotion that had intensified 15 years prior after the death of his wife. Elsewhere in the city, another, more chaotic kind of evil was at play. In a quiet cake shop, as the clerk was preparing to close for the night, a strange man who had been lingering over a single piece of cake refused to leave. When she politely asked him to go, he turned on her, his demeanor shifting from quiet to menacing. He revealed that his left hand was a prosthetic, and hidden beneath it was a long, sharp knife. He used the blade to sadistically force-feed the terrified woman a bite of the cake. Soon, a policewoman happened to walk in and immediately drew her weapon, telling the freak to leave. After the man left, the officer offered to drive the shaken shopkeeper home. But as they got into her car, the man appeared from the back seat and killed them both. This was El Corvo, a psychopathic hitman known for his sadistic cruelty. The next morning, Elisa was driven to school under the watchful eye of two of Vicente's best bodyguards. Her father, knowing he had countless enemies, took no chances with her safety. While their car was stopped at a red light, a homeless man approached, begging for change. When he was ignored, the man flew into a rage, smashing the car's rearview mirror. The two bodyguards got out to teach the bum a lesson, but they had severely underestimated him. The homeless man was actually Chris in disguise. He expertly and systematically took down both guards, then chased down Elisa as she tried to make a run for it, successfully kidnapping the cartel boss's daughter in broad daylight. Later that day, news of the kidnapping reached Vicente, and he exploded in a fury. He vented his anger by torturing the two bodyguards who had failed so miserably to protect his daughter from a single man. Once he was done with them, he got on the phone and mobilized his entire criminal network. He put a massive price on his daughter's kidnapper's head, making it clear he was willing to pay any amount and spill any amount of blood to get her back safely. Chris finally stopped his car deep in a secluded forest and let Elisa out of the trunk. The moment she was free, she tried to make a run for it, but strangely, Chris didn't act like a typical kidnapper. He was calm and seemed to have no intention of hurting her. He explained that he was an old friend of her mother's and a former close associate of Vicente. He claimed that before her mother died, she had made him promise to get Elisa away from the cartel life, fearing she would be consumed by that violent world. Elisa, however, wasn't buying it, thinking it was just a made-up story to trick her. To prove he meant no harm, Chris took a huge risk and handed her his gun. But the plan immediately backfired. Elisa took the pistol, pointed it right at him, and demanded he take her home. Chris simply started driving away from the city, and when an angry Elisa finally pulled the trigger, she was met with a useless click. The gun had been empty all along. A short while later, Chris pulled into a gas station to refuel. Seeing her chance, Elisa bolted from the car and screamed for help. Her cries attracted the attention of 4 young men who, trying to be heroes, immediately ganged up on Chris. While Chris was busy dismantling his would-be rescuers, a fight that barely lasted a minute, Elisa managed to get to a payphone and call Vicente. But just as she was about to tell him her location, Chris caught up with her. Her escape attempt now over, Chris tied her hands to make sure she wouldn't try running off again. As they drove towards an unknown destination, Elisa's constant whining finally pushed Chris to reveal his true connection to her. He wasn't just a friend of her mother's. He was her biological father. He explained that they were a couple 15 years ago, but an incident had landed him in prison for her entire life. Elisa was left completely speechless, struggling to process the news that the man she knew as her father wasn't actually related to her at all. Back at his mansion, Vicente was growing more restless by the hour. He ordered his right-hand man, a man named Nick, to double the bounty on the kidnapper's head, making it clear that money was no object as long as he got his daughter back safely. But Nick's loyalty was questionable. After leaving Vicente, he made a secret phone call to the psychopathic hitman El Corvo, informing him that Vicente's daughter was in play. His movements were suspicious, hinting that he had his own sinister plans in motion. Meanwhile, Chris took Elisa to a small diner to get some lunch. In a moment of truce, she asked him to tell her more about her mother. Chris described their inseparable bond and then dropped another bombshell on her. Her mother's death wasn't an accident. She had been murdered by Vicente's own men. Elisa refused to believe it, unable to reconcile the image of the kind, loving father she knew with that of a cold-blooded killer. Their conversation was cut short when a group of gangsters, clearly Vicente's men who were tracking them for the bounty, swarmed the diner and attacked Chris. While Chris was busy fighting off the new threat, Elisa was captured and taken to the headquarters of an allied gang leader. The boss immediately contacted Vicente and put Elisa on the phone with him. Without hesitation, she confronted Vicente about her mother's murder, a question that left him completely baffled, especially after she mentioned Chris's name. But before he could answer, all hell broke loose. El Corvo and his own crew stormed the building, starting a brutal massacre. In the ensuing chaos, Elisa managed to escape her captors, even grabbing a gun and firing at El Corvo to slow him down. Just then, Chris arrived on the scene and immediately engaged the knife-handed psychopath. But for some strange reason, El Corvo seemed more focused on capturing Elisa than on fighting Chris. Despite having only one functional hand, the hitman's power was immense, and even a skilled fighter like Chris found himself completely overwhelmed. Just as El Corvo was about to finish him off, Chris was saved by an unlikely hero. Elisa, seeing her rescuer about to be killed, slammed her foot on the gas of a nearby car and rammed it straight into the psychopathic hitman. She helped a wounded Chris into the car, and they sped away. As they drove, Elisa, still reeling from everything, pressed Chris for the truth about her mother's death, finding it hard to believe that Vicente, the only father she had ever known, could be the monster he was describing. Chris finally laid all his cards on the table. He explained that years ago, he, her mother, and Vicente were an inseparable trio of thieves. But when her mother became pregnant with his child, Vicente saw an opportunity. He orchestrated one last big heist and then deliberately set Chris up to take the fall, landing him in prison so he could have both the money and the woman he coveted all to himself. The story, full of betrayal and greed, finally started to make sense to a heartbroken Elisa. When they stopped to take a break, Chris told her that the diamond necklace she always wore was actually a gift from him, given to her when she was just a baby. He had chosen diamonds because he wanted her to grow up to be just as strong. He then shared his last memory of her mother, who had visited him in prison. She had told him how miserable her life with Vicente was, how he was abusive and controlling, and how she feared for Elisa's future in the cartel world. She made Chris promise that if anything ever happened to her, he would one day get their daughter out. Her death, Chris insisted, was no accident. It was on Vicente's hands. At the same time, Vicente had arrived at the scene of the earlier massacre, only to find all his men dead and his daughter gone. What was even more shocking was the sight of El Corvo, a brutal figure from his own dark past, standing amidst the carnage. That night, Chris tried to steal a car, planning to get Elisa out of the country for good. But Elisa put her foot down. She still wasn't ready to fully trust him and refused to leave Colombia, the only home she had ever known. She argued that Chris was a stranger who had no right to upend her life, regardless of their biological connection. In the middle of their argument, the car's owner showed up. As Chris was busy trying to threaten the man into giving up his car, Elisa saw her chance. She jumped into the driver's seat, stole the car herself, and sped off, leaving Chris behind. She drove straight to a payphone and tried to call Vicente for help, but her attempt was cut short. El Corvo appeared out of the shadows and immediately came after her. Chris arrived just in time to intervene, but the hitman got the drop on them, holding them both at gunpoint. With both Chris and Elisa tied up, El Corvo began to torture Chris, demanding to know who he really was. In a moment of defiance and final acceptance, Elisa shouted that Chris was her father. Hearing his daughter finally claim him brought a flicker of triumph to Chris, even in the midst of the pain. But for El Corvo, this revelation just sparked a new, sadistic idea, and he proceeded to beat Chris unconscious. The next day, Vicente found Chris had been hanged from a tree by El Corvo, kept alive only by precariously balancing on a single tire. Seeing the man from his past, the man he had betrayed and thought was gone forever, filled Vicente with rage. He emphasized that Elisa was his daughter now, and that Chris, a poor ex-con, could never provide for her. In a fit of anger, he kicked the tire out from under Chris, leaving him to strangle. But at the last second, realizing that Chris was the only one who could possibly get his daughter back from the now rogue El Corvo, he cut him down. The two fathers, bound by their mutual love for Elisa and a deep-seated hatred for each other, were now forced into an unholy and unstable alliance. On the tense drive to the meeting point, Vicente tried to clear the air at least partly. He admitted to Chris that while he had indeed framed him all those years ago, he was not the one who had killed Elisa's mother. He swore that even though Elisa wasn't his biological child, he had always loved her as his own. Their uneasy truce was interrupted by a call from El Corvo himself, who agreed to let Elisa go, but only after he met with both of them. It was during this call that the final betrayal was revealed. El Corvo had been working with Nick, Vicente's own right-hand man, to overthrow the cartel. Hearing this, Vicente, filled with a cold fury, ended the call and, without a word, immediately executed the treacherous Nick on the spot. As they continued their journey, Vicente explained his dark history with the hitman. He had used El Corvo's services for his business, but the man's sadistic tendencies had become a liability. Vicente had tried to get rid of him by chaining him up and dropping him into an industrial crusher, but El Corvo had miraculously escaped by cutting off his own hand, slaughtering all of Vicente's men in the process. This whole ordeal, Vicente knew, was personal revenge. They arrived at a massive, abandoned factory where Chris, Vicente, and his two remaining bodyguards split up to find Elisa. It didn't take long for Vicente to find his men. They were already dead. El Corvo calmly greeted him and led him to a horrifying sight. Elisa was chained to a conveyor belt that was slowly inching towards the mouth of the same industrial crusher he had used years ago. In a truly sadistic twist, El Corvo pointed Vicente to a saw, telling him he could save his daughter if he could just cut through the chains on her arm or maybe her arm. Without a second thought, Vicente scrambled onto the machine, frantically trying to break the chains, but they were too thick. Realizing the only way to save her was to sacrifice himself, he prepared to jump into the crusher to jam the gears. He couldn't bear to cut off his beloved Elisa. While Vicente was trying to save Elisa, Chris engaged El Corvo in a brutal final battle. In the middle of the fight, the hitman gleefully confessed the whole truth. He admitted that he was the one who had killed Elisa's mother, but that it was on Vicente's order. He added the cruel detail that Vicente had only wanted the murder to look like a suicide, but he had gotten carried away, torturing and assaulting her before the kill, which is what had enraged Vicente and led to their falling out. Hearing how the woman he loved had been so cruelly treated sent Chris into a berserk rage. Just as he was about to land a finishing blow, El Corvo stabbed him, taking him out of the fight. With Chris bleeding out on the floor, El Corvo grabbed Vicente and dragged him over to Elisa, forcing him to confess everything as she was being pulled closer to the crusher. For his daughter's sake, Vicente tearfully admitted it all, that he had ordered her mother's murder out of jealousy, and that Chris was, in fact, her real biological father. As Elisa was just inches away from the grinding gears, a wounded Chris panicked and shouted at her to throw her diamond necklace into the machine. The hard, dense diamonds were just enough to jam the gears, and the conveyor belt ground to a halt at the last possible second. As El Corvo turned to push the injured Chris to fall from the height, Vicente saw his one final chance at redemption. He lunged at El Corvo, pushing them both over the edge and into the ground, sacrificing himself to save both Chris and the daughter he had always loved. Elisa could only cry, her heart filled with a confusing mix of love and hatred for the man who had raised her and betrayed her. Now, the only parent she had left was Chris, who was on the verge of death himself. Sometime later, Elisa was seen making a pilgrimage to her mother's grave, placing flowers on the headstone. She wasn't alone. Chris was there with her, having miraculously survived his wounds. In that quiet, peaceful moment, she looked at him and for the first time, finally called him father. The film ended on a final ominous note. Back at the abandoned factory, the body of El Corvo, which had been lying next to Vicente's, had mysteriously disappeared.